Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. So thrilled that you could spend your lunch here today with us. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about business transformation and really just kind of organizing chaos, like big concepts. So one of the things that I wanted to do here from just a very quick note of context, some of the topics that we're going to go into today are by themselves almost full degree programs, right? We're going to touch a little bit on change management and some of the other things. And because this is just a quick overview, we have to stay very high level. But all of these concepts, this 1 hour of content for the most part, comes from nearly 48 hours of content from our full business architecture certificate course at Metro State that you'll learn more about at the end. So just kind of bear that in mind that I'm certainly not going to be able to go deep on a lot of these topics, but really want to hit on some of the highlights. So I start a whole bunch of my presentations with this slide that really talks about why do organizations change, right? So every organization that exists today, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a corporate, public, private, they're all designed to get the exact kind of results they want. And when they want different results, there's often this realization that you've got to do something different. You've either got to introduce new capabilities, you've got to introduce new ways of doing things, or think differently. And that's what typically provides the impetus for organizations to undertake business transformation. So, but the question is when we say business transformation, this term gets thrown around an awful lot. So what do we really mean? Business transformation at its most fundamental level is just that really fundamental or big change within an organization. And these changes can often be driven by either external or internal factors. So it could be major market changes or environmental changes that are happening. It can be new competitors that are entering or other major disruptions. It can be internal, where an organization decides to either merge, acquire, or divest a portion of its business. And how do you then link those components together? Obviously, the big one that everybody always thinks about is technology. And that's why you see this note on the bottom right. It isn't always just technology, though, right? A lot of times, business transformations can be focused on a lot of different things beyond just technology. So don't limit that concept of transformation to simply technological transformation. Especially nowadays, we hear a lot about things like AI and the disruption and how that's transforming businesses. But again, it can be a lot more than that. So just kind of want to level set on what business transformation is. These are not small changes, right? So if you think about transformational change in the context of other change, I've got this little kind of graph that shows, the scope and the time that change happens. The first kind of change that a lot of people think about is this incremental change, continuous improvement, Lean Six Sigma stuff, right? This is oftentimes, I refer to this as the 10%, right? You're making small changes in order to improve the business, constantly learn, constantly grow, constantly get better. Then there's this middle ground, which is kind of the step change, where you might undertake a full process reengineering, might introduce some pretty significant tech enhancements without a full, maybe replatforming. You might introduce robotic process automation. This might also include things like offshoring certain parts of the business. Those are step change. They're bigger, they're meatier, but again, they're not really transformational in the way that the business fundamentally operates and does its work. Transformation change is much bigger than that. This is where you are fundamentally changing the value stream in terms of how, as an organization, you are delivering on the value proposition to your customers, or maybe even changing that value proposition. Maybe you're introducing a new service line of business where before it was just a product line. Maybe it's a full-scale tech replatforming. I'm betting many of you on this call have been involved in some kind of a tech replatforming, right? My latest gig at Thomson Reuters, we were focused in on essentially an SAP transformation because the version of SAP that we were on was already, for the most part, not applicable or not or going to not be supported. SAP had extended life support for the longest time, but it was time for businesses to shift. And so things like SAP tech replatformings, moving to Oracle, some of those are big ones, or big fundamental business model changes. So these I often refer to, you'll see that 10x. These are the 10 times changes. So for example, again, incremental change, if you think about it, we're making these small 10% changes. 10x changes are really multiplications of growth or change that are happening. The big piece here that, and you're going to hear this a bit as a theme, is these things take time. These are not short incremental kinds of projects. They do take time. Don't try to rush it and don't try to shortchange it. And you'll hear that this is one of the big reasons why transformations ultimately fail. So, and why do we talk about transformations failing? So this one's pretty scary, and this is a stat that I actually re-looked up just for this presentation, and I will tell you this statistic has stayed consistent for almost the last 10 years. Roughly 88% of transformation efforts fail to actually deliver on the original intent of the transformation. We just are not good. Businesses are not good at providing effective transformations and executing effective transformations. So today is really about understanding why. Why do these things fail, and what can we do a little bit differently to try to move them in the right direction? Because the reality is business transformation happens all the time. There is no industry, there is no organization, there is no business that is immune from the need to transform and change. And again, you're seeing that with things like AI right now that are forcing organizations to pivot and adjust. So why do they fail? If so many ultimately don't fail, and there are lots of articles, and you can go out and pull some McKinsey stats and some Bain stats and some Accenture articles that will tell you. This is my perspective, so I want to be very careful to say these are the three things that I have consistently seen in almost every struggle that I've been in business transformations. And these common threads seem to permeate through all of them. Number one is just a lack of a vision of plan. And this one I think is so important because I'm seeing it right now. So take AI, right? AI is the current flavor of the month, maybe the flavor of the year. And I'm not saying that AI doesn't have benefits and value, but so many organizations right now are just jumping in. They got to do something with AI because AI is the thing. It's the buzz term, and all of our investors want to know what we're doing with AI. But they don't really understand how AI is going to be meaningful to their business model. And I'll give you an example. Anybody here aware that there is, and I can't believe this, a toilet with AI functionality now? Really? That doesn't seem very well thought out to have artificial intelligence for a toilet. Is that really one of the features that's going to be important to consumers? That feels a little bit like an organization decided they had to introduce AI of something, and so they just tried to kind of put it on there. So this not having a vision, not having a plan is really important. And one of the things that is so important with the vision and the plan is what are the specific outcomes that you want to accomplish? If you don't know where you're going, if you don't know what the end point is from your journey, you will forever be meandering, lost in the woods. So know at the very least what that end point is. Your path will change. And this is one of the other things that I always used to say about like agile development. The journey is agile, but the destination is always understood and set. And if you don't have that North Star and you don't have that journey and you don't have that vision for where you're going, you're gonna get lost and you're going to waste resources, money, and you're gonna create a lot of disruption. Number two is the failure to incorporate the human component. So this one I think is, again, really important. And this is probably one of the themes that you will see from a lot of those external articles that are out there is that organizations generally don't take into consideration the people component. Either they're leaning too heavily on just a few experts, or they're not thinking about the change. I'll give you a great example. When I was at a local nonprofit here, we were shifting from Sybase to Oracle. And as we did that, we suddenly realized we had to train all of these technical individuals on this new Oracle platform. Well, guess what? We did that. No sooner did we train these people in this new platform than they began to get poached by other organizations in the cities that were paying more for the Oracle skill set, not realizing that the Sybase and the Oracle skill sets not only had different technical skill requirements, but also different financial and different compensation requirements that we had not taken into effect. So we're going to talk about people because it is more than just the technical skills. It is about things like compensation. It is things like culture. It is all of that. And then finally, leadership failures. This one I'm going to get pretty direct on when we get there. But ultimately, leadership failures, in my opinion, are one of the top reasons that things fail. And like I say, there's a slide in here where I get into the kind of the brutal, honest truth, where we'll talk about some of the leadership failures that I've witnessed. So let's talk about each one of these. What the plan, right? What can we do? I love this quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it basically, he said, look, plans are of no particular value, but the planning is indispensable. And I will tell you from a military background and from an organizational background, this is so true. Um, my life didn't follow my plan. If it did, I would be right now relaxing on my yacht in the Caribbean with my private helicopter. Life doesn't often follow the plan that we set forth, but because we do the planning, we begin to account for the contingencies that we're going to encounter along the way. And that's why having this plan and understanding that active planning is going to be so important. And this is also going to kind of begin to segue into some of those things that I talked about from a leadership failure perspective. You're going to hear me talk about things like not being agile. And by that, I mean small a agile. Adapting the plan as you learn more is so critically important. But if you've done the planning, as you encounter the unexpected, you're going to have thought about the potential contingencies that need to be put into place or that will help you respond to the things that you didn't plan for or didn't foresee. Business architecture is a great skill set to do this. And this is one of those things that I have come to really respect this tool in my toolbox as one of the key things. And primarily because it ultimately is focused on creating a blueprint of the organization and more importantly, a common vision for the organization. And the way that they do that is by using some key tools. I'm just going to focus on a couple here, right? So business architecture is kind of this bridge. Most organizations are really good at defining things like their mission, their vision, their goals, their outcomes. What they're not really good at doing is then designing the organization to achieve those and having clear objectives and clear accountability and authority to do those things. We tend to jump straight from strategy straight into execution, and we just start doing the work with, again, not understanding, not having that plan. And that's where business architecture can really help us define where it is that we're going so that we know the end state and we can adjust again as we go along. Business architecture does this through a couple of ways. It looks at an organization as a set of capabilities. And again, this is one of those terms that I feel like gets used a lot and means a lot of different things. From a business architecture perspective, it specifically represents what an organization does. We don't think about how well they do that. That comes in a later step of maturity assessment. It really is just what do we have to do to deliver on our value proposition? So things like human resource management, that's a capability that every single organization, public, private, regardless of their status, nonprofit, has to do. They have to manage human resources. They got to manage payroll. They've got to manage benefits administration. Those are capability. They're the building blocks of an organization. One key thing I will point out about capabilities is just they are not all created equal. So some capabilities are considered those competitive advantage capabilities. They're the things that set us apart from other organizations that are doing work like us. Those capabilities are the most important because, again, if you are not performing your advantage capabilities better than everybody else, you're going to fall beside the wayside. Other capabilities we might not need to do as well. So again, how we perform and how well these things perform, the maturity assessments that comes with capability mapping and capability assessment are really important to understand so that you know what you want to improve and where you're going. A lot of times these are also static, so they don't change a lot. But you might need or be forced to add new capabilities. So again, the concept of AI, this is that constant theme that is just right in front of us all right now in present day. AI may not have been a capability that a lot of organizations had leading into the last 2 years. They now have to develop a new AI capability and figure out how to then link that capability. All right, so capabilities aren't kind of by themselves. They are enabled. If that's what we do, then every capability is enabled by four things. And everybody here has heard these things, or at least you've heard of three of them. People, process, tools. Sometimes that tools one is referenced as technology. I like tools a little bit better just because in some cases, organizations, it isn't actually always technology. It really is tools. Think about, printing organizations that have large printing presses and manufacturing tools. So the other last one here is information, and this is the one that often gets left out. A lot of times I hear like people process technology. Information is probably one of the most important overlooked enablers. A little quick caveat on these enablers is this list does not necessarily align directly with like the business architecture body of knowledge. That has changed, and as they've begun to evolve, I really appreciate the simplicity of this kind of previous one, and so we have not adjusted towards the BizBoc. But again, these enablers essentially determine how well that capability will perform. So I talked previously on the previous slide a little bit about maturity assessments. That's where we start to get into each one of these. If you know you have to perform human resource management as a capability, do you have the right people, the right skill sets, the right framework from a compensation and incentive plan? Do you have the right policies? Do you have the right just stuff in place to make that work? Same from a tools perspective, right? Do you have the systems that are necessary to manage your human resources, to manage vacation time? All of those things that go to that. So these enablers ultimately determine how well a capability performs, and that helps an organization then determine where do I need to invest. So again, why is this relevant to this idea of business transformation? Because if I'm ultimately transforming and introducing potentially new capabilities or significantly modifying existing capabilities, it's going to be one of these four things that I'm going to have to spend some time on. In fact, probably all of these things to make sure that I'm moving that capability in the direction that I intend for it to go. So again, understanding this kind of these layers of capability and enablers, this is where you're developing that plan for business transformation and you understand. Why is this so important? And I'm going to give a really specific example from a recent organization that I was at. So we were, as I indicated, we were doing an SAP transformation. I was in essentially the order to cash end of the business, and we had a fundamental question that needed to be answered. What kind of a financial model and financial billing perspective did we want to have? Did we want to bill in arrears or in advance? We had four different parts of the business. Those of you that are in order to cash or in finance will understand how significant the implication of that simple question is from a financial and from a system perspective. In arrears versus in advance is a big deal. Now, the problem is those four lines of business within this organization did it differently. And they wanted finance, the goal was to have a single way of doing business. They either wanted it all in advance or all in arrears. We could do that. But now you are basically completely upsetting the apple cart, and all of the ways that one of those business units tracks revenue, you're going to fundamentally alter. Have you thought about that? Do you understand the implications of that? That question didn't even get asked until we were probably almost 2 years into the conversation. And I have now been gone from that organization for a year. And I will tell you, after talking with colleagues, it still has not been answered. How can you introduce a new SAP platform if you haven't answered those kinds of questions and defined those outcomes? So again, planning is really important. People. So here's just a quick look at the enablers. I'm going to run through these pretty quick. This is more for your reference. But again, are the people able and willing to do the job? And again, it is more than just the individuals, the skills. It's also things like that competent incentive structures, the culture, et cetera. Process, right? Are they documented? Are they efficient? Are they standardized? This is just, again, some of the basics. Tools. Are they current and competitive? Do you have the right platforms? Do you have the right tools? Do they work? Are they too expensive to operate, et cetera? Are they still supported, i.e. by essentially the developer, the owner of that platform? Important stuff. And then finally, information. And again, I talked a little bit about how this one is often, I think, ignored or forgotten about, but this one is so important. If you don't have good information, you will make bad decisions. And that is just simply a matter of fact. It isn't an opinion. So if your information isn't well organized, isn't accessible to the decision makers, and again, let me give you an example. I once got pushback because I was introducing, again, a new claims platform at an organization that I was at. And I set up an entire Scrum team. I had a function or two feature functionality teams. I had essentially other Scrum teams. But then the one that I started to get pushback is I had a reporting Scrum team. And people were like, you can't have a reporting Scrum team. They're not actually developing anything. And my response was just this. How many times do you think, to pick any director, VP, executive level individual, logs on to the claims platform in a given day? And the answer was, well, I don't go into the claims platform because I don't need to use it. But then how do you operate? Like, what is it that you're consuming? And ultimately, the answer was reporting. We needed to make sure that the reporting that we needed from that system, that leaders would enable leaders to make decisions, was thought about in advance. And oftentimes that reporting team was actually informing the feature and functionality teams, maybe what data points or data fields that were needed in order to enable the downstream reporting. So this information is really important. Highly recommend that you don't lose sight of this one. So is it available and understandable? All right, let's get into the human component. This one's probably one of the single most important ones. So I want to first make the distinction between change management versus change leadership. A lot of organizations do change management and they do it pretty well. It's typically a dedicated role. It tends to be very tactical. We tend to do things like have change control and other things that we have in place. What we don't do well is that change leadership. And this is all about how are you bringing people along that journey? All leaders are responsible for change leadership. And this conversation is specifically going to focus on that change leadership component. The problem is we don't train leaders to be good change leaders and change advocates. We don't equip them with the skill sets oftentimes to be effective in that change leadership and in doing the things that they need to do. So, what is change leadership? Let's talk about this a little bit. It's all about getting people to adopt a change either in the way that we work or how we do things. And for those of you that have ever read the book Crossing the Chasm, great book. This one is really about, the book was written from more a product adoption perspective or technology adoption. But I've noticed and really applied this to almost any change. You have various groups that essentially fall into these categories, right? So you've got the enthusiasts, the people who embrace brand new technologies or brand new change right from the beginning. Visionaries also kind of do this. We're the kind of folks that we get on a roller coaster, we throw our arms up and cheer and just joy because we're having a blast, the change roller coaster. And change doesn't scare these people at all. Then you've got the pragmatists, right? It's the folks that, well, I hear what you're saying, but tell me a little bit more. Give me a little bit more detail. I need to be convinced. The conservatives are the folks that, they're thinking, well, I don't really see why we need to change. Things are working just fine the way they are now. And then finally, the laggards, the folks who to this day are still maybe using a flip phone. The bottom line is what Jeffrey Moore found is if you don't have a plan for getting the pragmatists and the conservatives on board with your change, crossing this chasm is how he puts it, you're going to be in trouble, period. You will not find the product adoption or the change adoption that will sustain that change in the long term. So you might have the initial excitement from the enthusiasts and the visionaries, and it might look like things are going great. But if the pragmatists and conservatives at the very least don't get on board, you won't sustain that change. So what do we mean, again, about change, right? Let's understand what this change means, because again, it's all about people. I like to say that change starts with an ending. It's ending how we do things today. We're essentially ending the status quo and we're starting towards something new. When anything ends, when anything in our world changes as human beings, we tend to go through this disruption period where we might deny that it needs to change. We might have fear, anger, aggression, frustration. This can happen very quickly. This dip can be mild. It can be very deep or not. After we get into this change and we're down at this bottom and we start looking towards exploration, we might start to get more hopeful and creative and enthusiastic. But I want to point out this transition, this circle in the bottom. We don't all just go through this curve once and we're done and we're all happy. Oftentimes, this can change day by day. I might come in one day and have a lot of hope and enthusiasm and excitement about where we're headed, and then find out some new detail that causes me to backslide, that forces me back into this anger and fear and frustration and beginning to question the change all over again. So in other words, we just kind of go back and forth, backsliding some days, making progress other days. It isn't until we finally get into that rebuilding that we start to begin that new future. Understanding human beings go through this change. Every single human being does, but they all go through it differently. Understanding how people are going through this, equipping your leaders to have the right conversations is really important. And again, if you're seeing somebody who's kind of stuck in this disruption side, and as a leader, your first your first instinct might be to be like, wow, this person just can't get on board. Really? Or have we not effectively sat down and provided the right level of leadership that's needed to help that person kind of get through? So again, really important to understand this. Another really critical component of this is understanding the timing of change. And this one I can tell you, I have been bitten by, I've seen people get bitten by it over and over. Let's just take that change curve, just exactly like we had from the other slide. We might have sponsors and execs that start to go through this first. So the decision makers who decide to start a business transformation, they start with that change before anybody else does. And then they bring on some project members, people who they're going to ask to help lead this change. And then eventually everybody else starts to go through that change and learn about the transformation that's coming. Let me ask a question, and I'll make this a bit rhetorical, so you don't have to answer, but I want you to just think about for just a minute what might happen at this given point in time. We've got sponsors and execs who are just in the peak of the rebuilding. They're ready to start towards the future, and yet everybody else is now down at the lowest point in that change curve. Imagine the difference that's occurring in terms of expectations, excitement, buy-in, enthusiasm, and all of the disconnects that could occur and do occur at this point in time. So again, just what I'm saying throughout this change and throughout the people person and the people component is just don't forget about the people. Without people, organizations don't exist. They are the one constant. And there's a really, really wonderful book that kind of gets into this. I will tell you it's a difficult read, but if you're interested, it's called Leadership in the New Science by Margaret Wheatley. And she really talks about how people ultimately and culture ultimately decide how an organization functions. And, she, for many years, Margaret was kind of a blue suit consultant. And she was frustrated because she could never really find a business model that fit. And it wasn't until she started hearing about essentially like, physics and some other, really esoteric kinds of concepts that she realized people are that dynamic. They're what ultimately are the unpredictable component that needs to be considered. All right, this is one of my favorite slides. This is a slide that was up in almost every single cube or office I ever had because it helped me remember what was needed for change to be effective. And I wish I could remember the source of this. I modified this into this format, but I forgot where the source was, so I apologize. But ultimately, when you have a vision, you've given people the skills, the resources, a plan, and incentives. You're going to get change. But what if any one of these is missing? What if we don't have a vision? Well, now we've got confusion, right? Because we don't know where the destination is. We don't have that end state that we're supposed to be striving to achieve. What if we don't have the skill sets? Well, now you get anxiety because people aren't sure whether they're going to be successful in this new future state. They don't know if there's going to be a place for them in this new future state. What does that look like? And this is where people will start to resist. If you don't give people the resources, they're going to get frustrated, right? Again, I have seen this over and over again. We think this project and this system will run $54 million. Okay, you can have 20. Okay, then we have to cut out all of this scope. Well, no. You still have to deliver all of the scope, but at less the price. Well, I got news, folks, and this is an analogy I used to use with executives at companies. You can't go on to the Mercedes dealership and ask to buy a car that's priced the same as the Chevy Chevette or the Chevy Prius. That's not how this works. You get what you pay for. So if we're going to reduce the resources, then we've also got to reduce the scope. Finally, what happens if we don't have a plan? Again, we don't know where to start. We're not sure where to begin. This is where you start to get a lot of false starts and stops. We waste time trying to figure out where to even go with kind of the vision that we want to do. So, what's the plan? What's the route we're going to take? What are the things that need to change? Who are the people that we need to engage? That's all part of that planning process. And then finally, if we don't have the right incentives, and by incentives, I don't just mean the cash, I mean why. If we don't help people understand the why behind this change, why are we doing this? We're going to end up with apathy. Okay? Because here's the reality. If there's one constant that is required for any change, any meaningful change to happen, it's that you have to be dissatisfied with the status quo. That's where the incentives come in. If you're not dissatisfied with how things are now, why would you change? All right. So all components are needed. All right, leadership. Let's talk about leadership. This is the last one, and then we'll get into some questions and some other things. So um, I've worked with McKinsey at multiple different organizations, and one of the things that I really appreciate about their organizational health index is it really gets into some of the people and leadership components in terms of, thinking about how organizations achieve transformational change. One of those keys is clear accountable roles. And I often say authority and accountability must stay together. In fact, I used to tell my boss all the time, you can't divorce the A's. If you are giving somebody authority with no accountability, bad stuff happens. Sometimes really bad stuff. For those of you that grew up maybe in the 80s and 90s, stuff like Enron, stuff like fraud, because there is no accountability. They get to just do whatever it is they want to do, and they're not accountable for the outcomes of those actions. That's a bad place to be. But if you also give somebody accountability for an outcome, but you've given them no authority to do that from a leadership perspective, how frustrating is that? And I can tell you from personal experience, very frustrating. And you have probably all been in that situation at some point. You've been asked to deliver an outcome, but you've not been given the authority to actually go make the changes that are necessary to achieve that outcome. That's a pretty tough place to be, especially for your most important and really successful leaders, because they just get really frustrated at their inability to deliver. So let's just talk about this decision-making role, because this is one of the keys from a leadership perspective that I've seen a lot of organizations fail at. Having a clear decision maker is really important, and every decision is going to have a different decision maker. But I'm going to bring you back very quickly to this idea of the financial revenue recognition that I talked about from an order to cash, in advance versus in arrears. There was only one person who was able to make that decision because all of the presidents of the lines of business had a different perspective. The CFO and or the CEO were the only people who were going to be able to make that decision and ultimately drive that. But that wasn't clear. And the decision kept trying to be made at lower levels. And the minute that it got made at a lower level, guess what? One of those presidents of the lines of business just shot it down. So we never got past being able to make this decision. Understanding everybody's role in the decision-making process is really important. Oftentimes, and this is a bit simplistic, I know, but I often say with the decision maker, there can be only one. You can't really share decisions because people have different goals, perspectives, outcomes that they're trying to pursue. And it's very difficult to have multiple decision makers. One of the other things that I will point out from a decision-making perspective, I was asked after I made my transition from military. So I was 23 years in the US Army before coming into corporate America. And at one point I was asked what, kind of what were some of the biggest changes or the biggest differences. What I would tell you is it was around this decision making. So the military has what's called the military decision making process, the MDMP. That process is specifically focused on making decisions. But one of the things that is so important here is we all knew who that decision maker was. And that was the commander who got to make that call, the commander of the organization. So that clarity of having that decision maker, everybody understood it. In fact, those decision makers even got to wear green felt tabs on their shoulder boards that designated them in a command and decision making position. All right, so let's get into the difficult truth from a leadership perspective. These are some things that I have seen, and many leaders don't want to hear this. I myself struggled with some of these for a long time, but I'm going to tell you these are the kind of things, if we really want to get better at effective business transformations and create better leaders, we need to be thinking about these things. And I have seen after 30 years of working with leaders in military, in public, private, nonprofit, and corporate environments, I can't tell you how many leaders I've seen that fail in some of these kind of key categories. Number one is they don't want to have the tough conversations. I personally struggled with this early on, but got over it pretty quickly in the military because that's how those communications happen. Tough conversations doesn't mean they have to be bad conversations. We do not have to abdicate our empathy and our compassion when we have a difficult conversation. We can do that and we can be respectful as we have those conversations. But my goodness, I can't tell you how many leaders I've seen that just kind of beat around the bush. They just hope things will get better with that person because they don't want to have that tough conversation. They don't trust. And maybe the better term here is not trust, but almost respect the people that work for them. And I'm going to give you a very personal example. I was part of a leadership team of a technology organization, and we were finalizing the budget with the CIO. And a question got asked about were we at a point that we could begin sharing and cascading the information about this budget with our teams and with our subordinates. And the CIO got introspective for a minute, and I thought was kind of trying to debate: is it is the budget gelled enough? Is it do we think there's going to be any major changes? And his next words really shocked me. He said, "Well, I suppose, but it's not like anybody's really going to get it anyway." He actually felt like people weren't smart enough to understand the budget nuances and the financials. We often do this where we withhold information because we don't think people are ready to hear it yet, or it's going to create too much consternation or too much confusion. Never underestimate the level of intellectual curiosity and an intelligence of your team members. They know what's going on. People see what's happening. And as a leader, if you're not saying anything or withholding the information that they can clearly see through the actions that are happening, you are going to lose credibility, you're going to lose trust, and they will not respect you. I am an advocate, and I will tell you, I've been burned by this, but I had a choice to make. I am an advocate for maximum disclosure at the earliest possible opportunity because people figure it out. And yes, on occasion, you will get burned by that. But the better outcomes have always outweighed the few instances where I've been burned by this. So please, as a leader, if you're in a leadership role, respect the intellectual curiosity of your team. Bring them along with you. People are adults and can handle hearing tough information. If it's not fully gelled, just tell them that. hey, here's where we're at, here's what's going on. We don't really know what the outcome's going to be, but we'll let you know. Fail to commit. This one's pretty simple. I used to tell my team, do not nod to me in the vertical in a meeting and agree with me, and then walk out and shake your head and start complaining. We have to commit, even when our personal interests are at essentially at odds with the organizational outcomes. The organization always wins. It has to, because if our personal interests get in the way of the organizational outcomes, then we will always be in an adversarial position. So commit, even if you don't like it. If the decision maker has made that decision and has listened to the input from everybody, but then has made a decision that you disagree with, suck it up and adhere to that decision. Because if you fight it, all you're going to do is create consternation and more just frustration within the organization. Lack agility. All right, so I talked about this one. The plan goes off the rails because we've discovered something new and suddenly we have to adapt. We don't. We just continue to drive to dates. We continue to hold on to scope that may no longer be relevant. I just am shocked at how many leaders will dig their heels in on really dates and information that was given so early before we really understood what we were going to be doing. And yet we are forced to hold to that date. And I have been a part of situations where, for example, we released code that we knew was not ready to go because we were forced to hit a date. And guess what? It created nothing but problems and issues. And then, of course, everybody wants to know, well, what happened? We couldn't adjust. And then finally, lacking humility. Leaders do not have all the answers and do not always have all the information. Trust your experts, recognize that they have more information and oftentimes more insight than you do, and they're trying to inform you. So again, I wrote an article, wrote an article on LinkedIn a long time ago called Ignorance and Ego. I'm really sad to say that ignorance as a word has this negative connotation, and yet all of us, we are all ignorant of a great many things. Ignorance by itself should not be a bad thing. When our ego gets in the way of us acknowledging that ignorance, that's when bad things happen. All right. So, questions. I'm going to wrap up here with about 10 minutes left. Want to make sure that we get some any opportunity to ask any questions. Beth, do you want to just have them like text those to you or?
Yeah, they can drop those in the chat. Oh, sorry. They can drop those in the chat, and then I have one while that's happening.
Yeah.
Um, so at the Business Architecture Guild conference last week, I heard a speaker say, we no longer need to do the 3 to 5 year strategic initiative plans anymore. AI and the pace of business make all of those plans obsolete. And I have to say, part of me was like, woohoo! But now I listened to your presentation today about the importance of planning and understanding your advantage capabilities. And then I saw that you still had mission, vision, values as part of that slide. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Again, Beth, it's a great point. And I think a lot of people want to essentially, they talk about the pace of change being so fast. This comes back to that why I think that quote is so important. Recognize that when you make a plan, that plan will change. There's almost no situation where that plan isn't going to change. But again, it's the planning. That's the important distinction. As you are developing that plan, you're thinking about what if, what happens if, what if this happens, what if our competitor does this? You start to develop at least a thought process around the contingencies. The plan has to make a whole bunch of assumptions about what's going to happen. And in fact, in the military, we even define facts and assumptions, the things we know to be true and the things that we're assuming will be true when we do this. Those assumptions are going to alter the plan, and there's no getting around that. But if you haven't even thought about what the assumptions are that you've made, when those curveballs happen, you will not be prepared. So again, this is where it isn't so much about don't spend a lot of time putting the detail in the journey, the project plan. Put the detail in the outcomes. Where do I want to be? What do I see this changing? And that's where that vision, that end state is so important. Again, in the military, we used to call this the commander's intent. At the end of this mission, it was one paragraph. At the end of this mission, here's what I intend the world looks like when we get done. If people don't all agree on what happens with that, and the reason why that commander's intent, I'm going to stay on the military for just a minute. The reason why that was so important is if the mission went to H in a handbasket, if we knew the commander's intent, we still knew what we needed to do to try to drive to that end state. So that's where that planning comes in. It's the thinking about what could get in our way. How will we respond to that if something happens? And essentially just thinking through that proactively rather than constantly being in a state of reacting. Okay, now we got to do this. Now we got to do this. Oh, that was a bad trade. So let's do this. Again, that's where that chaotic chaos starts to occur is you haven't even thought about what the end state is that you're trying to achieve.
I appreciate that. While we wait for questions to come in, if you want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
So Mandy is one of three instructors in our business architecture, now business transformation course. So we had a very solid business architecture course that was more about business capabilities and modeling, and we are shifting it just a little because it was already headed in that direction to be kind of half about that people piece and half about those more technical business architecture modeling and capability pieces. Next slide. So if you are interested in taking that course with Mandy, can you go one more, Mandy? Slide by. Thank you. If you're interested in taking a look at that course, Business Transformation Strategy to Execution, there's the QR code that you can scan. It'll take you to our IPD website. This is a non-credit course. So it's no homework. There is some small group work, I'm not going to lie, but we try to do almost all of it in class. So if your group works efficiently in class, and it has been said, even though it's non-credit, the rigor is like master's degree level. So hopefully you have a chance to take a look at that. One more slide. I did drop in the chat earlier a link to our change courses. So if you're someone who's like, I need to help people in my organization lead this change, not be the change management person, but lead change, and they don't need enterprise. That slide was dropped in already, the link. We are doing something at Metro starting next week, and Mandy is facilitating these. We are interested in your talent acquisition people. Uh-oh.
Sorry.
There it is. Oh, that's all right. We're interested in hearing from your talent acquisition people as a university. I think in terms of this, Mandy, when you talked about change and where we're headed, we want to make sure that wherever we go as a university, in terms of traditional degrees, micro degrees, credentials, we are aligning ourselves with the people who use those, not just our students, but the employers. And so we want to make sure we're hearing from employers that we don't spend 3 to 5 years designing something that at the end of the day, you guys don't want to use. So if you think you or someone at your organization would like to be in a Mandy facilitated discussion on changing credentials or changing job descriptions, changing what employers are looking for when they hire, go ahead and send me an email or drop your name in the chat and I will get you the registration link. These are small sessions. We're only having 10 people per session. So it's not a public link because we're trying to make sure that we get a nice cross section of nonprofit, public sector, corporate, and all industries. So like I said, send me an email or drop your name in the chat to send me a message in chat to let me know. We'd love to have you. The more voices we hear from, the better on target we will be with our ending commander statement on what we're trying to do with higher ed. One more slide, which is next month, calculating the ROI of learning. So if you want to send people to all these classes or professional development and aren't sure how to get it in your budget, this next month's webinar will give you a spreadsheet that will help you track the ROI of keeping your people upskilled and ready for their work. So I do not think we had any questions come in, Mandy. I hope that
Yeah.
means that people were like totally on board and not overwhelmed. Or maybe both. Maybe they're on board
Yeah.
and overwhelmed. It's hard to say. But a couple people left early. Rick said thank you. He had to head off to another meeting, and other people have said the same thing. So thank you for your time. And hopefully you know how to contact Metro to get a hold of us if you want any professional development for your people. All right. And with that,
Awesome.
um, I think we'll say goodbye. Hope to see you next month.